In a city of 8 million voices, Nancy Wilson had learned to disappear inside her own. It was a rhythm she knew by heart, the steady pulse of exhaustion that lived beneath her ribs, keeping time with the hiss of the espresso machine at Café Bora and the clatter of ceramic plates at Harnell House. At 24, Nancy had mastered the choreography of survival. Smiling when required, translating documents during stolen moments on the subway, and pretending the hollow ache in her chest was just fatigue and nothing more. The introduction. New York had promised her everything, but delivered only debt. Specifically, $173,000 in medical bills left behind by her mother, a legacy of hope that had turned into a ghost haunting every paycheck. Nancy's only solace was the Korean language, a gift from her mother's obsession with dramas during chemotherapy. To the world, Nancy was just a waitress from Accra. In her mind, she was a bridge between worlds, even if she only used that bridge to translate Kim Kai export labels. Everything changed on a Tuesday when the air in the restaurant grew cold. Logan Kwan Park entered Harnell House, carrying the city's darkness on his shoulders. He was dark gravity in a bespoke suit, a man who didn't just walk into a room, he took ownership of it. While clearing his table, exhausted and invisible, Nancy watched his cold dismissal of a subordinate. The insult slipped out in a whisper, a biting, fluent Korean curse. Arrogant bastard who thinks the world is his footstool. The silence that followed was deafening. Logan didn't look away. He smiled, a slow, predatory tilt of the lips, and leaned in. "Say it again," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that shattered her invisibility. "This time, look at me." The lunch rush at Harnell House felt like a battlefield where the only casualties were Nancy's nerve endings. The air was thick with the scent of fermented chili and the aggressive steam of stonepot bibimbap. Nancy moved through the narrow aisles with the practiced invisibility of a ghost, a tray balanced on her shoulder, her mind calculating the interest on her mother's $173,000 debt like a secondary heartbeat. Then, he walked in. Logan Kwan Park didn't enter a room so much as he annexed it. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of metal chopsticks and the chatter of tourists, seemed to hit a wall of cold, pressurized air. He was a vision of sharp edges and expensive wool, his face a sculpture of beautiful, terrifying indifference. He took the corner booth, the one Nancy was assigned to, and didn't even look up as she approached. "Water," he said. It wasn't a request. It was an observation that the universe had failed to provide it yet. Nancy set the glass down, her fingers trembling slightly from a double shift. As she laid out the side dishes, Logan remained engrossed in a file, his thumb flicking through pages that likely decided the fates of hundreds. When he finally spoke, it was to dismiss a man in a sharp suit standing beside him. He did it with a flick of his wrist, a gesture so casual and dehumanizing it made the bile rise in Nancy's throat. She thought of her mother, who had died with a smile and a thank you for every nurse, despite the pain. She thought of her own degrees gathering dust while she served a man who treated people like background noise. As she turned to leave, the exhaustion finally broke the dam of her restraint. In a whisper that barely disturbed the air, she let out a string of fluent, rhythmic, and biting Korean. "Oman han gashik," she hissed, the words for arrogant bastard rolling off her tongue with the precision of a practiced blade. "I hope your money chokes you before your ego does." She didn't stop walking. She didn't expect a reaction. In this neighborhood, men like Logan Park didn't hear waitresses, and they certainly didn't speak the language of a girl from Accra. "Stop." The word was a low vibration that seemed to hook into her spine. Nancy froze. Slowly, Logan closed his file. He turned in the booth, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a predatory focus that made the restaurant disappear. A slow, terrifyingly beautiful grin spread across his face, a look that wasn't warm, but hungry. That was a very specific dialect from the South, Logan said, his voice dropping into a smooth, melodic Korean that was even more perfect than her own. The kind used by people who intend to draw blood. He leaned forward, propping his chin on a hand that cost more than her life. "Repeat it," he commanded, the grin widening. "This time, look at me when you call me an arrogant bastard." The black sedan that arrived at Nancy's walk-up was as silent and predatory as the man who owned it. The driver, a wall of muscle in a charcoal suit, didn't speak. He simply held the door open, an unspoken command that Nancy felt she had no choice but to obey. As the car glided through the rain-slicked arteries of Manhattan, Nancy watched the city lights blur against the glass, her reflection looking small, tired, and dangerously out of her depth. Park Industries Tower was a monolith of steel and glass that pierced the low-hanging clouds of the New York skyline. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of minimalism, all white marble and cold, indirect lighting. Nancy felt the grit of her 12-hour shift at the cafe clinging to her skin like a second, unwanted layer. She was ushered into a private elevator that ascended with a nauseatingly smooth velocity, depositing her onto a floor that felt entirely removed from the reality of the streets below. Logan Kwan Park was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city as if it were a game board he had already won. He didn't turn when she entered. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until the only sound was the distant hum of the building's climate control. "Nancy Wilson," he said finally, his voice a low, resonant chime in the empty space. He turned, and the sheer force of his presence made the air feel thin. He held a manila folder, the one containing her life's failures. "Born in Accra. A scholarship to Columbia that withered when your mother's lungs did. And a debt of $173,000 that ensures you will never truly breathe again." He walked toward her, stopping just inches away. The scent of sandalwood and expensive ink preceded him. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with the calculating intensity of a jeweler examining a raw diamond. "You have a rare gift for the nuance of language, Nancy. You don't just speak Korean, you understand the soul of it. You see the gaps between what is said and what is meant." He tossed the folder onto a glass desk. "I have a rotting problem in my organization. Whispers I cannot hear and shadows I cannot see. I need a ghost who can listen. Work for me for 90 days as my personal analyst. 3 months of your life in exchange for the title to your mother's ghost. Every cent of that debt, gone." Nancy looked at the folder, then up at the man who was offering her a miracle wrapped in a death warrant. The intimidation was a physical weight, but beneath it, for the first time in 5 years, was the spark of a choice. "And if I say no?" she whispered. Logan's smile was thin and sharp. "Then you go back to Harnell House and spend the next 30 years apologizing for being alive. But we both know you've already stopped being a waitress, Nancy. You stopped the moment you looked at me." The transition from the frantic steam of a restaurant kitchen to the pressurized silence of the Park Industries' inner sanctum felt like a deep-sea dive. Nancy's new office was a glass-walled cage tucked deep within the linguistic intelligence wing, a place where the air tasted of ozone and expensive filtration. She was no longer carrying trays. She was carrying secrets. Her desk was occupied by a workstation that hummed with the collective whispers of an empire, and for the first hour, Nancy simply stared at the encrypted streams of data, feeling like a ghost haunting a machine she didn't yet understand. As she began to dig into the intercepted grey communications, logs that masqueraded as mundane logistics for shipping companies and private security firms, the true scale of Logan Kwan Park's world began to crystallize. It wasn't just a business. It was a sovereign nation with its own laws, its own borders, and its own ruthless justice. Logan didn't just manage assets. He moved pieces on a global board that influenced city elections, controlled shipping lanes in the Pacific, and dictated the price of stability in neighborhoods the police were too afraid to enter. He wasn't a CEO. He was a king in a bespoke suit, and she was now his most specialized spy. By noon, Nancy's eyes burned from the blue light of the monitor. She had been tasked with analyzing a series of high-level exchanges between Seoul and New York. To a standard translation software, they were boring discussions about the quality of imported steel. But Nancy saw the gaps. She noticed the way certain honorifics were dropped in the middle of sentences, a subtle linguistic insult that signaled a shift in power. She tracked the use of specific regional slang from Busan that didn't belong in a formal business setting. These weren't steal orders, they were loyalty tests. Logan entered her office without knocking, his presence immediately narrowing the room. He stood behind her, leaning down to look at the screen. The heat from his body was a sharp contrast to the cold glass around them. Nancy pointed to a highlighted line of text. "They aren't talking about the shipment being late, Mr. Park," she said, her voice steady despite the proximity. "They're talking about the man in charge of the dock. They're calling him a dry branch. In this context, it means he's being marked for removal." Logan remained silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting from the screen to her profile. The predatory grin from the restaurant was gone, replaced by a dark, appreciative gravity. "A king is only as strong as his eyes, Nancy," he murmured, his breath ghosting against her ear. "Most people look at the world and see the surface. You see the rot underneath." He straightened, his hand lingering for a fraction of a second on the back of her chair. "Keep digging. I want to know who is holding the axe." As he walked away, Nancy realized with a jolt of terror that she wasn't just translating words anymore. She was translating the mechanics of a coming war. The digital landscape of the White Tiger was a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts, a complex vascular system designed to move money without leaving a pulse. For 3 days, Nancy lived within the glow of the dual monitors, her mind mapping the flow of capital until the numbers began to take on the weight of physical objects. Most of the ledger entries were as clean as surgical steel, polished by high-priced accountants to look perfectly mundane. But as Nancy cross-referenced the linguistic metadata of the transaction memos with the actual transfer timestamps, she felt the first tremor of a fault line. It was a small, almost imperceptible stutter in the rhythm. A series of logistics payments for a warehouse in Incheon were being authorized using an older, formal dialect, a linguistic signature that matched the way the older board members spoke, but didn't align with the current security protocols Logan had established. When she dug deeper, she found a ghost trail, small percentages being skimmed off the top of every Kimkai export, redirected through a secondary server tucked behind a firewall in the Cayman Islands. It wasn't just theft, it was a systematic bleeding of the organization's lifeblood, hidden behind the very cultural respect Logan demanded. The office door opened, and the air pressure shifted. Logan didn't ask for an update. He simply stood at the edge of her desk, his shadow stretching across the data streams. Nancy didn't look up immediately, her fingers flying across the keys to pull up the divergent paths. "Someone is using your respect for the old ways as a cloak, Mr. Park," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "These authorizations are written in Satsui, specifically a variant from the older Busan elite. It's meant to look like it's coming from your inner circle of elders, but the syntax is slightly off. It's someone imitating them to bypass your New World encryption." She pointed to the ledger discrepancy. "In 3 months, they've moved $4 million. It's not enough to collapse the tower, but it's enough to buy a very large, very sharp knife." Logan leaned over her, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. For the first time, the cold mask of the Mafia Boss flickered, replaced by a raw, dangerous heat. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at her, his dark eyes searching hers for any hint of deception or fear. He found only the sharp, analytical steel of a woman who had spent her whole life surviving on the margins. "I have had 20 forensic accountants look at these books in the last year," Logan said, his voice a low, rough velvet. "None of them saw the stutter in the language. They only saw the math." He reached out, his thumb grazing the corner of the desk near her hand, a gesture that felt more intimate than a touch. "You didn't just find a leak, Nancy. You found the first crack in my foundation." The tension in the room shifted from the professional to something volatile and unspoken. The trust was no longer a part of their contract. It was becoming a bond. "Tell me," Logan whispered, leaning closer until she could smell the dark cedar of his coat. "Who is the dry branch that thinks they can steal from me?" The 80th floor penthouse was a cathedral of glass and silence, suspended above the glowing embers of Manhattan. Logan had summoned her not to the office, but to his private quarters, a space that felt less like a home and more like an observation deck for a man who ruled from the clouds. Nancy felt out of place in her thrift wool sweater, her braids pulled back into a practical knot, standing amidst the minimalist Italian leather and the cold, sharp scent of rain and expensive scotch. Logan was seated by a low table, not with a ledger, but with a small, hand-carved wooden figure Nancy had kept on her desk, a piece of Ashanti craftsmanship from her father's village. He turned it over in his large, scarred hands with a reverence that made Nancy's breath hitch. She had expected him to dismiss it as a trinket, just as the world often dismissed her. Instead, he looked at it with the same piercing intensity he used to decode power structures. "You move between worlds with a grace that most people never achieve," Logan said, his voice dropping into a low, intimate register that vibrated through the floorboards. "You were worried I would find your background a distraction, a barrier to the work." He stood, closing the distance between them until Nancy could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He held out the carving. "In Korea, we value the roots of the tree as much as the fruit. You haven't just learned our language, Nancy. You've filtered it through the strength of your own. You see things my men miss because you've had to understand the soul of survival in 2 different hemispheres." He reached out, his fingers ghosting over the edge of her jaw, a touch so light it could have been a trick of the air. Nancy didn't pull away. For years, she had fought to be invisible, to be a ghost that the debt couldn't find. But under Logan's gaze, she felt a terrifying heat. He wasn't looking at a debt-ridden waitress or a useful tool. He was looking at a woman who was his intellectual equal. "Your heritage isn't a shadow you have to hide from, Nancy," he whispered, his thumb grazing the dark velvet of her skin. "It's the steel in your spine. It's why you're the only one who can help me hold this empire together." In the reflected glow of the city lights, the glass cage of his world felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. For a fleeting second, the danger of the white tiger faded, replaced by the heavy, magnetic pull of a man who finally saw her, not as a ghost, but as a force. The air between them hummed with the weight of things unsaid, a bridge being built in a language that required no translation. The air in the White Tiger's tactical hub was always 5 degrees colder than the rest of the building, but today it felt subterranean. Nancy was alone, her screens flickering with the rhythmic pulse of global logistics, when the shadow fell across her desk. It wasn't the dark, magnetic gravity of Logan. This was something sharper, a coldness that smelled of menthol and old malice. Vincent Choi, Logan's most trusted lieutenant, stood behind her. He didn't lean in with Logan's intimacy. He loomed like an executioner. His reflection in her monitor was a distorted mask of aristocratic boredom. For a long minute, he simply watched her fingers hover over the keys, his silence a physical weight designed to make her stumble. "A butterfly in a lion's den," Vincent said, his voice a sibilant rasp in the quiet room. "You've made quite an impression on the boss, Miss Wilson. He thinks he's found a secret weapon. I think he's found a distraction." Nancy forced her breathing to remain shallow and even. "I'm an analyst, Mr. Choi. I find patterns. That's all." "Patterns," Vincent repeated, a thin, mirthless smile touching his lips. He stepped closer, his hand landing on the back of her chair with a sudden, jarring force. "The problem with patterns is that they can be rewritten. And the problem with girls who climb too high is that they forget how hard the ground is when they fall." He leaned down, his breath cold against her ear. "I've watched men stronger than you vanish into the Hudson for far less than the curiosity you're showing. Don't mistake Logan's interest for protection. In this world, the king is the one who signs the death warrants, and I am the one who carries them out." The threat was naked, stripped of the corporate veneer that usually coated the tower's operations. Vincent's eyes, dark and void of empathy, searched hers for the crack she had worked so hard to hide, the ghost of the girl who was drowning in debt. He was testing her, looking for the flicker of fear that would prove she was a liability. Nancy met his gaze in the reflection of the glass. She thought of the $173,000. She thought of the Ghanaian orchids and the Korean hibiscus Logan had spoken of. She thought of the fact that she was the only one who had seen the stutter in the ledgers, a stutter that likely led straight to the man standing behind her. "I've spent my life being invisible, Mr. Choi," she said, her voice dropping into a low, steady register that surprised even her. "You can't threaten a ghost with the dark." Vincent's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We shall see how long you remain a ghost once the sun goes down." He straightened his suit jacket with a sharp tug and walked away, his footsteps echoing like a countdown. The tension in the room didn't leave with him, it remained coiled in the corners, a silent warning that the internal rot of the White Tiger was no longer a theory. It was a war, and she had just been served her first summons. The silence of the midnight office was a heavy, living thing, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the server banks. Nancy's vision was beginning to blur, the lines of Hangul on her screen swimming like koi in a dark pond. She had been staring at the same Kim Kai invoice for 3 hours. A mundane shipping manifest for 300 jars of premium radish Kim Kai destined for a warehouse in New Jersey. On the surface, it was the definition of bureaucratic boredom. But Nancy's intuition, sharpened by years of navigating the unspoken subtext of her mother's favorite dramas and the sharp realities of the New York streets, told her the document was screaming. She began to strip away the formal business jargon, looking not at what was written, but how it was structured. The quantities were odd. prime numbers that didn't align with standard shipping crates. She ran a frequency analysis on the honorifics used in the sign-off. There it was, a specific, archaic form of respectful waiting that had no place in a modern trade agreement. It was a linguistic cipher, a code hidden in the very heartbeat of the language. Nancy's pulse quickened as she cross-referenced the fermentation dates listed in the invoice with the lunar calendar. The dates weren't for food, they were timestamps. When she aligned the first letter of every third sentence, a message began to emerge from the static. It wasn't about cabbage or shipping lanes. It was a countdown. The tiger sleeps when the moon is thin. The cage opens at 0200. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The thin moon was 2 nights away, the night of the syndicate's annual foundation gala. The cage wasn't a physical structure. It was the security perimeter of Logan's penthouse. This wasn't just a ledger discrepancy anymore. It was the blueprint for a coup. The invoice had been authorized by a digital signature that Nancy had spent weeks tracking, a signature that looped back through a dozen shell companies directly to the encrypted terminal in Vincent Choi's private office. She sat back, the blue light of the monitor casting long, skeletal shadows across her face. In her hands, she held the exact moment Logan Kwan Park was scheduled to die. She thought of Vincent's cold breath against her ear, his promise that she was nothing but a distraction. She looked at the Ashanti carving on her desk, the symbol of a heritage built on endurance. For a moment, the old Nancy, the ghost who wanted to disappear, urged her to delete the file, to take her meager savings and run before the glass tower shattered. But she wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the only person who could hear the scream hidden in a whisper. She reached for the secure line to Logan's private quarters, her finger hovering over the dial. The translation was complete. The treason was no longer a shadow. It was a map. The gala below was a shimmering sea of silk and diplomacy, but in the 80th floor penthouse, the air was thick with the copper tang of impending violence. Nancy stood in the center of the darkened study, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had delivered the warning, but the cage had already begun to close. The silent alarm on her workstation flickered crimson. The security perimeter had been breached not from the outside, but from within. The heavy mahogany doors burst open, and the silence was shattered by the rhythmic thud of suppressed gunfire. Logan was a blur of lethal motion. He didn't reach for a phone, he reached for the shadows. He moved with a predatory grace that Nancy had only glimpsed in his office, his bespoke jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink and scars of a king who had fought for every inch of his throne. "Stay low, Nancy." Under the desk. Logan's voice was a rough command, barely audible over the shattering of glass. Nancy scrambled into the knee-hole of the heavy oak desk, but her mind didn't shut down. While Logan engaged 3 men in the foyer, the sounds of bone hitting bone and the heavy grunts of exertion echoing through the suite, Nancy reached for the tablet she had hidden under the blotter. She didn't have a gun, but she had the ghost of the system. She watched the security feed on the small screen. Vincent Choi wasn't in the room. He was in the server closet 2 floors down, manually overriding the elevator locks to bring up a second wave of assassins. If those doors opened, Logan would be flanked. "Logan! The elevators!" she screamed over the chaos. She began to type, her fingers flying with a precision born of desperation. She didn't try to hack the main firewall. Vincent expected that. Instead, she targeted the climate control system she had analyzed weeks ago. Using the linguistic override code she'd discovered in the Kim Kai invoices, she flooded the elevator shafts with fire-suppressant halon gas. The system registered a false class of fire, triggering a hard vacuum seal on the lift doors. On the monitor, she saw the elevator stop dead between floors 78 and 79, trapping Vincent's reinforcements in a steel tomb. A stray bullet hissed through the air, embedding itself in the bookshelf inches above her head, showering her hair with splinters of Ashanti wood. Logan cleared the last man in the room, his chest heaving, a thin line of blood trailing down his temple. He looked at the elevator lights, then at Nancy, who was still hunched over the glowing screen, her face set in a mask of fierce intelligence. "The second wave is stuck," she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. "I locked the cage." Logan crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling her up from the floor. He didn't check the perimeter first. He checked her, his hands framing her face with a terrifying tenderness. "Blood and ink," he murmured, his dark eyes burning with a mixture of rage and awe. "You didn't just listen, Nancy. You fought." The sirens were screaming in the distance, a herald of the end of the old regime. The white tiger had been purged, and as Logan held her against the cold glass of the window, Nancy realized the ghost was dead. In her place stood a woman who had rewritten the ending of her own story. The aftermath of the coup had left the white tiger leaner, sharper, and devoid of the rot that had threatened to consume it. For Nancy, the change was more profound than the shifting of syndicate power. It was the dissolution of the ghost she had spent 5 years perfecting. The $173,000 medical debt, once a mountain that obscured her future, had been vanished with a single keystroke from Logan, leaving her standing in a landscape that was no longer defined by what she owed, but by who she was. The roof of the Park Industries Tower had been transformed from a cold helipad into a lush, private sanctuary, a literal bridge between their histories. Under the soft glow of the Manhattan moon, Nancy stood amidst a garden where the air smelled of damp earth and possibility. To her left, the vibrant, star-shaped petals of Ghanaian orchids climbed a trellis of dark wood. To her right, the delicate, waxen blooms of Korean hibiscus reached toward the city lights. It was a horticultural impossible, 2 worlds blooming in a soil they had shared for the first time. Logan found her there, his presence no longer a dark gravity that threatened to pull her under, but a steady warmth that anchored her. He had shed the armor of his bespoke suit for a simple black shirt, looking less like a king and more like a man who had finally found home. He stopped beside her, his gaze traveling from the orchids to the woman who had saved his life with nothing more than her intellect and a stutter in a ledger. "The debt is gone, Nancy," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that settled in her chest. "But you're still here." Nancy turned to him, meeting his dark eyes without the shield of her invisibility. For the first time, she wasn't looking for an exit or a shadow to hide in. "I'm not a translator anymore, Logan. And I'm definitely not a ghost." "No," he whispered, stepping into her space until the scent of cedar and rain enveloped her. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that felt like a promise. "You are the bridge. You are the only person who truly sees me." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers in the quiet space between the city's roar and the garden's peace. "Oman Han Gashik," she murmured, the old curse now a term of fierce endearment. Logan's laugh was a bright, rare sound that danced through the hibiscus. "Repeat that," he commanded softly, his lips brushing hers. "This time, look at me." And she did. In a city of 8 million voices, Nancy Wilson had finally found her own, and it was speaking a language of love that required no translation. They stood together on the edge of the world they had built, seen, chosen, and unforgettable.